when I wrote The Universal Heart, I wanted to think very deeply and very explicitly about how we might live if we took the golden rule one bit seriously. Yeah? The golden rule, if we took it one bit seriously. And I have gone on and on and on thinking about the golden rule. I've gone on and on thinking about it because it's absolutely at the heart of peacemaking. To see ourselves in others and others in ourselves. To recognize that what we most desire is what others most desire. To recognize that what most hurts us most hurts others. And I've been so intrigued, appalled, fascinated, all kinds of things around why can't we take this on as a human family? Why can't we take it seriously? It's a teaching that is in every single philosophy, every single religion. This above all, love one another. Why can't we? Why don't we? Especially, we know we are much happier when we do that than when we don't do it. So it becomes even more bizarre, doesn't it? When we don't do it. However, I also came to see that to a very, very great extent, we cling to certain kinds of defenses about why we should be doing something or why we could be doing something. And it takes us a very long time to realize that we can afford to be much more vulnerable and that we can afford to surrender some of those defenses so that we are moving through our interactions with others from a much more truthful place. That is, we can actually afford to see how things are right now and to cooperate with our circumstances. Because one of the major disruptions to equanimity, one of the major disruptions to peace of mind, one of the major disruptions to our relationships is our unwillingness, not our failure, but our unwillingness to accept things as they are. And again, there's no passivity in this. It's not a kind of resignation, oh, this is how it is, this is how it will always be. But if there is something that has happened in our lives, or in our circumstances, or in our relationships that cannot be changed, our outrage about it, or our anger about it, or our self-pity about it, simply adds suffering to our pain. It does not in any way soften our pain, nor does it bring us closer to the suffering of other people, a suffering that we in some way could share and repair. So this notion of cooperating with our circumstances is a really, really rich thing to think about. For example, let's just take the example of aging. Because if we are fortunate, we will age. If we are less fortunate, we will not age. And of course, in the processes of our aging, there is greater and lesser fortune. I see this everywhere. I see that some people enter the fragility of older age much, much younger than others, for a whole range of reasons, some of which they could influence and many of which they could not. Some of it is genetic, some of it is class privilege. We don't speak about that much in Australia, but we should. Some of it is that people have had one or two traumas too many. And some of it, of course, is physiological, things that can't be addressed. But however this is happening to us, and it could even be that we're having a crisis of direction at a much younger age, in our 30s or in our 40s, or we could be having a crisis of identity in our teens or in our 20s. This is a huge thing too. And instead of allowing this major obstacle to open doors of inquiry for us, not to provide answers, but to open the doors and say, I have to think about this more deeply. I cannot afford to limit myself only to what I already know. I cannot afford to limit myself to the banalities that are closest to hand. This is my chance to live more deeply. This is my chance to live more meaningfully. This is my chance to make my life more my own, to cooperate with the circumstances in which I find myself. And one of my great teachers on this, I would say, was a man called Viktor Frankl, and I've often spoken about him to you in different circumstances at the services and on retreats, because Viktor Frankl cooperated with his circumstances, which were living in the concentration camps, to such an extent that he not only was able to support others around him through the quality of his presence, through his affirming of hope arising from having meaning in our lives. Oh, it's so moving even to say these words. Having meaning in our lives around something greater than ourselves. This is a human need. It is also a need of the soul. It is the need of the soul to find affinity with something greater than itself. Yeah? With the world soul, with the supreme soul. Yeah? This is where inspiration is generated. And Viktor Frankl really understood this, and he so brilliantly and so passionately devised a psychotherapy called logotherapy, which is very rarely practiced, but has influenced lots of people who practice various forms of transpersonal psychotherapy, where you look into things primarily from the meaning that you can derive from them. Now, this is very different from asking, why did this happen to me? Why is often a fruitless question. Why shouldn't it have happened to you? Suffering is part of this human existence. We're mortal beings. We get ill. We make mistakes. We fall down. The crucial thing is getting up again. And we leave the body. We will all leave the body, this body. And the eternal self will continue. But that's a mystery for us. So the why is this happening to me question is not useful. But the meaning question is very, very useful. And it doesn't mean that you take a kind of direct message from every event. Of course not. But the meaning could be that you learn something about what you share with your human family. What you share with your human family, and how compassion for others who are suffering, perhaps suffering from the very ignorance that most drives you to distraction. Perhaps you will have more compassion for that ignorance and the suffering that it causes not only you, but others as well. Now, I was so struck recently because my daughter is studying as a mature age student occupational therapy. And she brought it to my attention that in the Canadian model of occupational therapy, and I've already spoken about this more than once, I'm so impressed. The Canadian model of occupational therapy has at its center two things that I think are absolutely so useful to us to think about. First, that each person is an individual. They're not just what's wrong with them. We talked about labeling this morning. We can often label ourselves, you know, I've got ADHD, or I'm this, or, you know, I'm a diabetic, or I'm a this, or, you know, I'm blind, or, you know, I'm this, or I'm that, or I'm old, or whatever it is. A label is always limiting. You know, even sometimes with our interfaith services, I think let's just even leave the word interfaith at the door. Even that, because people have associations with it. Let's just talk about inclusivity. Let's just talk about unconditional welcome. You know, we're so limited by labels. So that was one thing, that the occupational therapists are trained to think that each person's expression of whatever is happening now will be individual. And the medical model doesn't really like that because it's harder to manage. And a lot of medicine is about managing. But the second thing that I was very struck by was that at the heart of their model is what they call spiritual, which has nothing to do with religion and is everything to do with meaning. So I'll just finish this by telling you a little Viktor Frankl story. Years after the Second World War, and years after he had written Man's Search for Meaning, which is one of the essential books of your lifetime, Man's Search for Meaning, he was practicing as a psychoanalyst. He was originally a psychiatrist, but he was practicing as a psychoanalyst, practicing logotherapy. And an old man came to see him, who had been grieving for a very long time. Very long time. And frankly, if he'd gone to most GPs, he would have been given quite significant doses of antidepressant medication, I would think. Not any of the GPs who are present here. Because grief is different from depression, but it can be a very close cousin, and it can also be utterly debilitating. So Frankl, with his generous heart and his capacity to listen, asked the old man to talk to him about his grief. And the grief was for the loss of a wife who had meant everything to him. So we can imagine that that was the loss of companionship, the loss of history, the loss of passion, the loss of sharing, the loss of feeling that for someone else, you are the most tender and loved person alive. There are many, many losses that come with a grief, aren't there? And they don't always come with a death. They sometimes come long before a death, don't they? They do. And they are very real losses. And they are very hard reminders sometimes of our human frailty. But they can also be meditation bells about the strengths that we need, the soul strengths that we need, and that we must really allow ourselves to encourage in one another by our example of them. So Frankl listened and listened, and then he said to the man, "Tell me, how would it have been if you had died first? How would your wife have managed? I would really love to know, how would your wife have managed?" And Frankl, the person sitting with Frankl, said, she wouldn't have managed at all. It would have been absolutely devastating for her. I took care of whatever it was. And I can imagine that Frankel would have paused. I imagine, I don't know, but I imagine he was a man who had learnt to pause. And he said, "You saved her from that." And that was all that he had to say. He didn't give advice. He didn't say, join a club or find, community, or he gave the grieving man back a meaning, a most beautiful meaning, that for all the grief that he was suffering, he had saved his wife from a suffering that might have been even more terrible. And this is what love allows, isn't it? When we see someone we love, suffering, wouldn't most of us wish to take on that suffering rather than seeing them suffer? We would. And as we grow in compassion for the world and for our human family, for our brothers and sisters, we feel that more and more truthfully, that we would wish to save the other. And there are, in all of our lives, elements of suffering that we inadvertently cause, that as we grow more awake, we could call back from. The slightly critical word, the slightly prolonged, unkind silence, the refusal to give a real lavish praise, a refusal to perhaps hug as enthusiastically as we might, telling ourselves we're far too busy to ring somebody, telephone them until it's too late. There are all sorts of ways in which we can grow in generosity of spirit, in generosity of kindness. Be kind whenever possible, said the Dalai Lama. It is always possible. And in that simplicity, in that profound simplicity of practice, our lives become meaningful. We don't have to seek meaning. They become meaningful because we are learning what it means to be truly human, which actually means to be truly loving. Om Shanti.